Welcome back.
This is the second part of our mini-series of the 2021 Sales Engineering Compensation and Workload Report, which, by the way, was researched by Consensus. And we thought, let's go straight to the source. So we invited the CEO of Consensus and his marketing manager into the podcast, and we asked them a couple of questions. If you haven't listened to the first part that came out yesterday, this is where Jan and myself just go through the entire report and talk about some specific points. And in this one, we ask Garin and John some concrete questions on particular details.
Yeah, so the part yesterday was in German. So you can only listen if you're able to understand German. Today, of course, will be in English. And it's the first time that we have 4 people in our podcast all together. Which was a nice experience, and it worked out very, very well from my perspective. So we wish you so much fun with today's episode.
Sales Excellence, your podcast for software B2B sales and pre-sales. My name is Tim, and I'm a sales engineer at Seismic.
And I'm Jan, a pre-sales leader at SAP. Welcome to our new episode.
Jan, I have to announce something to you. Today we have a premiere, so to say. First time we actually have 2 guests on this podcast, which makes me incredibly proud. That's the way to pronounce that word. And the first person joining us is today John Cook, and he's a marketing manager at Consensus. Welcome to the show, John.
Thanks for having me on. Glad to be here.
Fantastic. And secondly, we have Garin Hess. He's actually the founder and CEO of Consensus. Thanks for joining us, Garin.
It's wonderful to be on the show, Tim.
In fact, when I stalked both of you on LinkedIn, I discovered, Garin, we actually were almost colleagues because you used to work at Calidus Cloud before, if I saw that correctly. So that was a that was a fun surprise to notice.
Yeah. Calidus Cloud actually acquired my last startup a good 10 years ago or something. So yeah, I worked with them for about a year.
Nice coincidence. So clearly you are sort of a serial founder, right? You just mentioned you founded already previously a company before Consensus, and Consensus is a demo automation platform, and I'm happy for you to sort of explain that maybe a bit further. But what I understand is it's specifically designed, obviously, to address pain points of the pre-sales organizations around the world, right? Why did you found that company, and why does your heart beat for presets like that to even found a company that addresses these pain points?
Oh, man. So I could maybe talk the whole time about this, but I'll try to keep it short. So there are a couple of things I'll share. One is early in my career, I've worked at enterprise software companies my entire career, even before I became an entrepreneur. And one of my main roles in the second company I worked for was training. So I was training new employees on product and on process and different things. And the product was old green screen, terminal kind of system. And when I first got hired there, I came in and they said, "Hey, welcome to this company." They gave me these 2 user manuals about 6 inches thick each and put them on my desk and said, "Read those for 2 weeks and then we'll talk." That was the training I got on the platform. They didn't even give me access to the platform. I'm just supposed to read these manuals. It was kind of the worst case scenario. Mm-hmm. But I was so horrified by that training experience that I really wanted to make it easier and better for other people. So I decided I was going to learn the product the best way possible. And so I literally read every page of those, and I went through and I did get an account, tested it all, became a product expert, and ended up becoming the person who knew the platform best in the company. They didn't have sales engineers at the time. This was my first kind of introduction to sales engineering. So because I knew the platform better than anybody and knew all the different configuration options and things better than anyone, I started getting called into sales calls. And then eventually when they started hiring sales engineers, I was involved in training sales engineers, right? So kind of by force of nature at that company, I got involved in sales engineering, and it really helped me realize how critical it was to be able to come on, understand the platform well enough that you could listen to the customer, understand what they need, and then say, this is how you configure everything to get what you need, right? And so from that time forward, I had a real strong affinity for sales engineering. But I'd say the reason I founded this company is because in my last startup, one day I was backing up the sales team. They were overwhelmed with leads, which was a good problem to have. But I did 6 demos back to back, and they were just kind of the Harbor Cruise demos, right? Introductory, standard demos, and I was exhausted by the end of the day. I literally had no time in between. And I just thought, I just did the same thing over 6 times, and I tried customizing it to each person that joined differently. But really, it was just kind of some of the same content, a different emphasis here, a different emphasis there. And I just thought, there's got to be some way to automate this,
there must
right?
be a better way.
Yeah, there's got to be a better way. And then we were also doing this trade-off where we had some customers that we would demo for, and other customers like, we don't have time. Sorry, we can't demo for you. You're too small, or you don't quite fit our ICP and different things. And so I just thought there's got to be some way to do that. So after my exit from my last startup, I was evaluating different ideas and new projects. And this was such a pain point. I started talking to sales leaders, sales engineers, even marketing leaders at the time, asking them about demos and how they handled this. And so that's kind of where all that started.
Perfect. So before we go into what Consensus is now doing on an annual basis, which is actually releasing a report on salary and workload specifically for pre-sales organizations, maybe one last point on that demo automation, right? So obviously with Consensus, you're sort of solving pain points for pre-sales, but that also means that potentially the demo is moving upwards in the sales funnel, right? Maybe more customers are seeing demos earlier. Where would you see the ownership of demo automation going forward? What's the vision for that category, so to say?
Such a great question, and just for your audience to understand what Consensus does a little bit. So Consensus is what we call intelligent demo automation software that helps scale pre-sales, right, or sales engineering. And so the way this works is using Consensus, your pre-sales team is going to build a library of reusable interactive video demos. And then the sales team usually sends those out on demand. And then there's all kinds of tracking to be able to understand who engages, who it's shared with, and what kinds of topics they're interested in. And all of this together reduces unqualified demos and can double your pre-sales team productivity. So that's really our objective and what we're all about. However, what you're saying is absolutely true. I think part of this stems from the fact that sales engineers are getting involved in demos and have been for a long time, quite early in the sales process, but they don't think of them as demos, right? The sales rep will call and say, "Hey, I need you to do a 15-minute demo," and that's usually really early in the buying process. And so one of the things that we like to talk about is that there are really 6 different types of demos, and there's a webinar on our website at goconsensus.com where you can learn about 6 different demo types and where they belong in the buying process. So, and some of them are really early stage before the lead is even qualified, right? And so this will get into, I'm sure, some of the report data we're going to talk about, but lead qualification is such a big deal. And there's a lot of dissatisfaction in the industry over unqualified demos. So what we're seeing, though, is that pre-sales types of content, what Gartner research talks about is content that's not easy to be faked, is in more and more demand across the buying journey, from the very beginning to the end, even afterwards, as they get into post-sale support and implementation and so on. So in one way, you could say yes, demos are getting into marketing, but what really one way to think about it is more and more pre-sales or sales engineering is being requested or in demand by buyers earlier and earlier. So are marketing doing more demos, or is it just that sales engineering content is being pulled or requested by buyers more and more, which is the way I think about it. So it's more that pre-sales is getting pulled into the marketing rather than marketing sort of taking over the demos.
Fair enough. So we've mentioned now the report already a couple of times. Question to you, John. Maybe you can give us like a high-level overview. What is the report about? What is in it? And also, why does Consensus even do it?
Yeah, you bet. So this is our second year publishing this report. It was the first of its kind to our knowledge, and we set out to better understand the problems that pre-sales was facing and some of the solutions and so on that people are finding out there. So the first thing that everybody wanted to know really was, what's everybody making in the pre-sales world, right? What is appropriate, what's high, what's low, all of these kinds of things. And so
Making in the sense of like salary making, right?
yeah,
That's what you
salary,
mean.
but also on-target earnings overall, right? So you've got most people have some kind of a variable component to their salary, right? In many professions. So how does that look in pre-sales? So we wanted to understand that, right? So that was the first thing that we decided to measure was what's your base salary, what's your on-target, what are your on-target earnings, and just so everybody understands what OTE means, what on-target earnings mean. The way we asked about that was, what is your total compensation if you were to hit your targets, right? So if you have a quota, assume you hit quota. If you have high, medium, and low targets, assume you hit the medium target, right? So that just kind of accounts for that variable component. And then there are so many issues that pre-sales deals with that are kind of unique to pre-sales that we wanted to better understand those. Everything from unqualified demos, right? We hear numbers of 50% in the field, that people are dealing with 50% of their demos coming through unqualified. So we were like, we want to know really what is that number across different metrics and so on. And then how are pre-sales people measuring performance? What are the KPIs? What are the how does it vary between leaders and practitioners? Do they report differently? All of this kind of thing. So we launched this report. It was a howling success our first year, and what was really fun was being able to publish not just a few insights here and there, but we really took a lot of pleasure in providing full distributions, histograms. You can see where you fall on a continuum as opposed to just measuring yourself against what somebody tells you is an average, right? That was the impetus behind the report.
So thank you for that, John. So obviously, the report is pretty comprehensive, right? In fact, I just recently looked at the 2020, and now I looked obviously at the 2021. There's a substantial higher number of pages. I think in total right now you have like 56 pages. So very comprehensive, but super interesting. In fact, and there's two sections, right? It's all about salary and it's workload, as you just pointed out. And we want to go into both areas here today. We're not going to talk about everything. We're going to sort of cherry pick a few questions here and there. And let's start with the salary section, right? So one of the things that occurred to me personally when I saw that stat, that there's only 25% of individual contributors that actually carry a direct quota, which, again, from personal experience is quite in contrast. I've often had a direct quota associated. And that's actually, there's minute differences between US, UK, and the European region. They all have that sort of in that space of 25%. Why is that so low?
We've had some of pre-sales leaders from places like Salesforce and so on who've discussed this. I think pre-sales traditionally is not as associated with carrying a personal number. Very often pre-sales is less associated with that. Lots of people have strong feelings on this, one way or the other. I think sometimes it comes down to cultural differences as well. I'll give you an example. If you carry a quota personally in the United States, let's say you're a pre-sales practitioner as opposed to a leader. In the United States, practitioners report a 14% higher median on-target earnings. So 14% higher overall earnings if they carry quota versus those who don't carry quota. And in the U.S., it's pushing 28% as far as pre-sales people who carry quota. If you look at the U.K., only about 15.5% of people carry quota, and those who do carry quota don't report a significantly higher OTE than people who don't carry quota. So it's only 4% there as opposed to 14% in the United States, right? And Europe kind of splits, between those two. So culturally, I think it plays a large role as well. Like in the United Kingdom, people are less used to carrying a personal number, and some people prefer that culturally for their company, right? The company prefers that the sales engineer, in pursuit of that trusted advisor role, not be accountable to a number in order to facilitate essentially kind of having the pre-sales person be able to circle around that table a little bit, right? Be sitting on the same side of the table as the customer. Quotas are seen as kind of interfering with that, I think, sometimes.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I would argue it's a huge mindset topic, right? I mean, if you have a direct quota associated to it and you're working on a deal, it makes your mind change to, okay, what will I get if we actually close this deal? It makes it so much more tangible. Again, that's a personal observation. Right?
We had a huge discussion about this in DemoFest during this last DemoFest, where people are asking, is ARR an appropriate KPI for pre-sales? Should they be held accountable to ARR? And the response, the consensus seemed to be overwhelmingly yes, there needs to be an element of ARR there. It becomes an alignment issue, right? We want to align everybody towards the same goals and so on. I know that there are people out there who claim to be able to align without doing that, but there was a big discussion on it, and it seems that most people are pretty aligned on having ARR be part of that KPI.
Yeah, and I was going to say, related to that, I don't know, Tim, if you're going to talk about the KPIs part of the report later, but the number one KPI is revenue and ARR, which kind of aligns to this thing about quota. But out of over 1,000 responses, right, there are only 624 that said that they have that's one of their KPIs. So that means there are about 400 out of the audience, right, 40% basically saying we don't have a quota or a measurement on ARR. Another interesting stat is 41 people said they don't get measured at all, like no KPIs at all. And so there's a big group in there in between that is focusing not on ARR, but on other kinds of measurements, demos performed, POCs, the technical win, all those kinds of things. So I think that while the industry is still moving towards quota and ARR or ACV revenue as the main metric, it's by far from everybody.
Yeah, I mean, that would have been my follow-up question, right? Do you see a trend? Like, you've done this report now twice, so you have the data at least compared to last year. I don't know, maybe also from personal experience. Do you see that there is a shift towards more quota carrying, or does it stay pretty much the same over time?
Well, we actually had expanded the survey this year, so we didn't actually ask about quota specifically last year. So this will be our first year of data on that. But I did want to mention that one other aspect to this, as far as pre-sales carrying quota versus sales carrying quota, et cetera, it's pretty rare to find a sales guy who doesn't have a number that they're accountable to, right? One of the elements of that is how pre-sales gets assigned and attached to deals, which is very different to sales. Sometimes you'll have a pool model where you'll be pulling pre-sales people in on a bunch of different deals. Sometimes multiple pre-sales people will be working the same deal. So carrying a personal number isn't as straightforward in pre-sales also as it is in sales.
Yeah.
So John, just quickly for the audience to clarify, so ARR is annual recurring revenue.
Correct.
And ACV is, of course, annual contract value.
Correct.
Thanks.
Yeah, fair enough. So, I mean, while I was browsing through this, there was one other question that came to mind where I was wondering, okay, maybe it would have been worth asking this. And maybe you did. I'm not entirely sure, even though I did respond to the survey. I was curious, do we know the average quota amounts of those people who actually do have a direct quota associated? Because that's a topic I have with my colleagues. Hey, what's your quota? What's your quota? Or maybe between friends that work at different tech companies or being in pre-sales.
You know what? We didn't ask that, but my gut tells me that it's going to vary widely based on not just the company that you're with, but also the size of the organization that you're selling into and the complexity of your solution and things like that. What we found as we dove into this survey, we found this last year, and so we've gradually tried to get more and more granular this year, but it's very easy to look at this. What you really need to find is a lookalike audience, a lookalike segment that looks like your own segment, right? And so we're trying to do that more and more, because things will vary not just by region, but they'll vary by the type of solution that you're pitching and a myriad of other factors.
Yeah.
But as far as the specific quota itself, that's not something that we've dived into yet, beyond just looking at what you can look at kind of the difference between salary and on-target earnings, and you can sort of see what the variable component is, but you can't draw very many direct conclusions based on total quota, vis-a-vis total quota from that.
Yeah. So before we switch to some of the sort of workload-related topics that you have in the report, one last question on the salary. So there seems to have been one guy last year who literally earned 2.1 million Canadian dollars. Did you go deeper into that one case that earned that much?
You
know, I want to know what he does. Or she.
I know, right? So we do our best to remove outliers, and sometimes there's obviously just typos here and there, but we dove in and we tried to vet that as well as we could. But at the same time, as far as diving into specific cases, we actually kind of anonymize, right, everything, because everybody, that's part of just making sure that everybody can can kind of feel comfortable sharing this stuff, because you can't, we can't tie it back to organizations or anything like that. Would love to be able to. I'd love to call that guy up, or girl up and find out what the heck is going on.
Maybe Quota attainment.
Contact me if you feel like telling me.
Sorry, Jan, go ahead.
Yeah, no worries. So just out of curiosity, and that was coming up to my mind listening to the three of you. So John, with all that data you gathered and all these details you got, I personally, over the last, I would say couple of years, from time to time, I have a discussion around what is the ideal compensation model for pre-sales, right? So with quota, without quota, MBOs, no MBOs, personal goals, whatever, right? So with all that data you gathered and with all these insights you have with the report and the research, is there like an idea you can give what could be close to an ideal compensation model for pre-sales? Knowing there will be differences, company size, territory, and all that stuff?
That's a good question. But just quickly, MBOs, I'm not familiar with the term.
Management by objectives.
Yes.
Just other KPIs besides quota, for example.
Like very individual KPIs, potentially, or maybe you have common MBOs for the whole team, but something like very specific, right? So you need to do this and that and whatever.
Well, we actually have a webinar coming up on paying pre-sales. As far as the ideal way to pay pre-sales, this comes back to a question to me that I frequently ask pre-sales leaders. I don't think it's very straightforward, and people have a really hard time articulating the answer, and that is, what constitutes a high-performance pre-sales team? Because ideally you want to pay in order to incentivize the things that you want the most. Right? I know Adam Freeman last year at DemoFest, he gave a whole session on non-financial pre-sales KPIs. I'm not sure if you guys were able to catch that, but he's big on tracking things that are not necessarily part of the bottom line. Things like pre-sales activities and feedback from the customer as far as their satisfaction, leading indicators like this, because financial KPIs are trailing indicators, right? You don't get this is for stuff that's already passed as opposed to stuff that might close in the future. And as far as an ideal way to do that, I think this is something that the pre-sales industry is really trying to figure out right now. But I will say this, the new pre-sales motions that are coming in, that are being more and more in demand, and by new pre-sales motions, I mean, we talked about how pre-sales is reaching forward into all the way up into marketing, and pre-sales is reaching kind of backward all the way into post-sales and so on. I have anecdotally heard that people are devoting more and more of their resources, direct salary resources, salary increases, higher pay overall, to people who are willing to engage in those different pre-sales motions. And this can be kind of a touchy subject because there really is a wide gamut in pre-sales as far as what pre-sales wants to be. Okay, I think the largest contingent are the pre-sales reps who are like, we do more than just demo. Let's talk about paying based on more than just demoing, right? We're strategic consultants, we're trusted advisors throughout the entire process. We want to engage and be a key part of this process, and most of the tools out there are kind of gearing towards that. And then there's also a contingent who are like, I just want to do my demos. And I think that the way you pay is you pay the first group, because the second group, their job is going to change significantly over the coming years.
If I could jump in on this question just from the CEO's perspective, because I wrestle with this all the time, not just with sales engineering compensation, but also all kinds of compensation. And there's one argument that says only pay on the outcome, which would be quota, period, right? Because if you don't get that, then what else matters, right? In fact, it used to be the technical win was everything. And I always thought that was kind of funny because if you got a technical win, but you didn't win the deal, well, whoop-de-doo.
No money.
So on the other hand, if you don't measure leading indicators, like John was saying, then you don't really have a path to know predictably whether you're going to get the lagging indicators. So if you see the leading indicators going into the bucket, then you'll likely get the lagging indicators. And it also is just, as John said, what you're trying to incentivize. I think an important thing to think about is just, are you working this out for junior or senior people? And as a leadership, in my opinion, should largely be paid on just almost solely on outcome. So pre-sales leader, in my opinion, should just be tied to quota, period. If you have junior sales engineers, well, you really need to incentivize their activities almost more than the outcome, even though you need to emphasize the outcome because you need to build the habits inside your organization that lead to the outcomes that you want. So I believe in a mixed model, but the more senior you become, the less mixed it becomes. And you still might be tracking those leading indicators for those senior people, but the pay is just on the outcome. So that's my 2 cents.
Yeah, thank you for that. And since we are already on the topic of KPIs, there was one question that came to mind while reading the report, right? Because I was looking at the popularity of the different KPIs, and there was one in there which I think is on place number 4, which is close percentage between won and lost, right? That's one KPI. And that is in connection with something else that is in the report, with a high degree of very unqualified activities, plenty of demos early in the sales cycle, not qualified, no discovery, and so on. And my thought was, okay, well, if you're putting a KPI up where I'm measured between close percentage won lost and do a lot of unqualified activity, that's really unfair, isn't it?
Yeah, very. Yeah, it feels almost underhanded that you're going to be measured on this, but if you don't have any qualification gates. And this is something that we find talking to many of our customers and pre-sales leaders and organizations is they really don't have anything to prevent the unqualified demo from happening. So if sales says jump, you jump. And if they ask for a demo, you do a demo. And the organizations that are being proactive about qualifying before sales engineering gets involved, which incidentally we call a demo qualified lead. So we've come up with this term, demo qualified lead, to say this is the gate that should happen. How do you qualify the lead in a way that then pre-sales should get involved or not? And so we call that the DQL, demo qualified lead. Well, the organizations that are implementing that demo qualified lead are able to reduce that quite a bit. And there are different ways that you can try to do that. But I agree that if you are measuring that close rate, you've also got to try to put in some gate that will help measure that because they're inversely related, right? Theoretically.
Yeah, absolutely.
And measure it. The more we talk to pre-sales teams, the more we realize that many of these things, many of these metrics, like how many of your demos are unqualified, how long does it take before a prospect gets a demo? Teams don't know their own numbers sometimes, right? These are things that we need as pre-sales teams to get a hold of, to get a handle on, just to know where our baseline benchmarks are, right? So we can track improvement.
So when it comes to the demo activities, right, one aspect that you're also mentioning within the report that I found quite interesting and triggered a thought on my own here is that you talk about the number of demos and the number of demos required to actually close a deal, right? And I think the median is currently sitting at like 3 or something, which are obviously quite a broad range. In some companies, you can close a deal after 1 demo. In some cases, maybe you need 20 and everything in between. The median is sitting at 3. And I was thinking it's obviously directly connected to the number of stakeholders, which is another aspect you also cover, right? How many stakeholders are involved in a deal? And I think you measuring the median is at 6, right? And obviously, I would expect, okay, the more stakeholders I have, the more demos I could do. But maybe, and this is the thought, right? Because I was torn, okay, with so many stakeholders, what is really better? More focused demos for each stakeholder, resulting potentially in more demos, but more focused demos? or just one really big bang, so to say, where everyone is involved that satisfies everyone? Or maybe the truth is somewhere in between. What are your thoughts on this one?
Mm-hmm.
Well,
Garin.
yeah. So we have a lot of thoughts on this, but yeah, it's interesting. The data shows that the median number of demos to close is 3, but if you've got 6 or more stakeholders, then you've got 4 demos to close, right? So there's this clear correlation. And you might say that the customer, the buyer, each stakeholder in the buying group, they want a demo uniquely tailored to them, right? If you just take it solely from the buyer's perspective, they would like to have a demo just themselves with the sales engineer, perhaps. But yeah, you have to balance that with the needs of the organization. So honestly, this is where we try to solve this trade-off, because in using interactive video demos, right, that's the intelligent part of intelligent demo automation, is it the technology automatically tailors the demo to each stakeholder and their unique interests. What we're seeing that some of our buyers are doing is in lower and mid-market deals, they're using these pre-built demo libraries, but many of our customers are also using demo automation technology to take the demo that they actually did, record it while they're doing it, and then they put it into the platform and send it out as a follow-on, because a lot of times these other stakeholders either aren't there, they haven't been identified yet, or they just weren't able to make it. And so they use that as a way to then tailor it when they're not there. So they're kind of doing this hybrid approach where they're doing the demo and they're obviously picking the personas they're demoing for, because you can't demo perfectly tailored to each person live in the same live meeting. But then they take that content and put it into the platform and then send it out in a way that the other stakeholders can tailor it. So it's this kind of mixed approach. If I didn't have a technology to support, I think you're going to have to do a trade-off where you're just focusing on the personas that have the most influence, right? So if you look at the stakeholder map and you say we've got 6 stakeholders, which by the way I think is low. I think it's underreported in this report. My contention in this is that sales engineers probably don't fully have a grasp on all the stakeholders that get involved. They see a certain group, and so they know how many typically get involved there. But I think sales ends up engaging with even more stakeholders. But at some point, you've got to figure out how you're going to address those stakeholders and which ones are if you make a stakeholder map, which ones count more, which ones are the heavier hitters, right? I'm sure that's what a lot of people already do. But again, we don't believe there has to be a trade-off. We think it's a false dichotomy, because you can use technology to make up the balance.
And on that subject really quick, I think the hinge point of this is the buyer, right? Because if we look at the pros and cons of demoing, one demo to try to get everybody on the call, right? From a buyer perspective, what's that experience like? Not great.
No.
Right? And as buyers, we are becoming less and less tolerant of things that don't pertain to us. We tune it out, and the companies that win are going to be the companies that don't make me do that. Right? That don't make me sit through.
Don't force me into your selling process. Follow my buying preferences.
Exactly right.
Yeah.
So the answer is the people who win are the people who are going to do that better.
Yeah. Although, I mean, sometimes I understand perfectly what you're saying. I agree with you, right? Although sometimes I would even argue, sometimes it's the buyer forcing the vendor into such a forum where they provide like 20 use cases to pitch in a 3-hour window.
That's true.
And then it's like an audience of 25 people and you're thinking, how should I manage that? It goes both directions. Yeah.
Yes. But this is the thing, is the buyer is saying, I need this, right? And the seller is saying, I can't provide that's impossible, right? I don't have the resources to supply that. And so that friction is where the opportunity lies.
So this also goes to another topic very near and dear to my heart, which is buyer enablement, which I won't go too far off onto that. But when buyers ask us to do those kinds of things that are not good for them, who should dictate what happens? Well, a lot of times the buyers are just going to dictate, but they shouldn't dictate without resistance, because as the sellers, we end up knowing what's better. So if somebody were to come to me and say, hey, I want you to do this pitch for 5 hours and 20 different use cases, and we got 6 different stakeholders, I would say, okay, we can do that, but I want to tell you our experience. We've helped hundreds of customers buy our technology, and let me tell you that is probably the worst way to go about trying to buy our technology. If it's possible, could I make some recommendations about a better way? And then I would lay out the recommended way that they should buy, right? Because as a seller, I've been through this. I'm kind of like the buying coach. I know this more often. I've helped hundreds of customers go through it. So generally speaking, we should exert more leadership in the sales process, or what I call it, the buying process, because we know what's better for them. And too often, whether we're in sales, whether we're in pre-sales, we just kind of roll over. Well, the buyer said they wanted this, so we have to do it. And I have found that if we explain the recommendation based on what we've seen other customers do successfully, many times the buyers will follow suit.
I would like to quote another German sales podcast that Jan and myself are really a big fan of, Volker Hein. He says, sales is anarchy, right? Just because your buyer is telling you to do something does not mean you really have to do it.
Yeah.
So I just
Absolutely.
love that quote. Perfectly in line with what you just outlined.
Right.
All right. So I think we're closing to the end. I have one last question for you. I would like to talk a little bit about demo preparation, right? And in fact, if I were to look at Jan, he would say it's all about preparation. He even says that to me in English, even though we obviously speak German to each other, because it's that dear to his heart, that sentence. And you have one aspect in there where you say, okay, what is the average preparation time? And what really was mind-blowing to me is that, well, the median is, I think, sitting at like 2.5 hours or something like that. And it includes preparation time, it includes the demo itself, and it includes follow-up, right? And now I'm thinking, okay, well, Jan and myself, we're always talking about the best practices of pre-sales, where you do proper qualification, you do discovery, you sit down, you do your demo flow, maybe do another second iteration of discovery before you actually go into the demo. And I'm thinking already 5 hours are over. Like, how do people end up at 2.5 hours? And is it not directly tied to doing these intro demos, these technical demos that are just not hitting the nail on the head?
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, if you look at the list, there was another area where we asked, what are your responsibilities, right? And there's technical demos, RFPs, POCs, discovery, intro demos, of which there are several types of intro demos you might get pulled into. You might have to be mentoring other new sales engineers, right? You might get called into support calls, product support, consulting calls, all kinds of things. And all this to say that most sales engineers that we've talked to, and the data backs this up, is that they just don't have enough time to do the activities that are most meaningful to them, that they think would have the biggest impact, and preparation would definitely be one of those that we hear about a lot. And so I think it's about understanding what activities sales engineers are doing, what are the key activities that you want them to be doing, and generally that aligns with what they want to be doing, because none of them want to be doing these early intro repetitive demos, for example, and figuring out how you can free up more of their time so they can spend more time. And this is one thing I don't think many pre-sales leaders think about, or sales leaders for that matter. Every time that my salesperson asks a pre-sales person to get on an intro demo that's non-qualified, I am taking that time literally away from the preparation to help close the really big ticket customer that I have at the later stage funnel. And so there's this opportunity cost that, as in pre-sales, we need to explain better when we say no. So in John Kerr's book, The Sales Engineer's Manager's Handbook, he has this whole section on learn to say no, right? And I think that one of the best ways to say no is with an explanation, like, no, because, I'd really love to, but what that will cause me to do is take time away from getting ready for this demo that I have tomorrow for such and such customer. And, and then that becomes this trade-off question. Do I want to do an unqualified intro demo, or do I want more time? And a lot of times when you start pushing back like that, you get leadership involved, and they can say, oh, no, we want you to focus and make sure we get this prep time necessary. So I think emphasizing the opportunity cost is really important, and it's often just not even considered at all.
I think there's probably not many better ways to actually finish a conversation like that with a quote from John Kerr, because both Jan and myself really admire him. So I think let's conclude here. I really appreciate you walking us through some of the elements of the report. Of course, the full report is available for download. Again, we're going to link it in the show notes below. John, Garin, I really appreciate you joining us here today. Thanks for sharing your experiences with us. And I hope we can maybe at some point revisit when another report comes out or when we find another topic to exchange on.
It's been a lot of fun. Thank you.
Love it, guys. Thanks, Tim and Jan, for having us.
Thank you so much.
Dear listeners, if you enjoyed this episode, of course, we would really appreciate if you give us a follow on LinkedIn or maybe the odd Apple Podcast review with 5 stars or maybe even some text, because we always appreciate the feedback of any kind. Thanks for tuning in again, and we will speak and hear you soon. Bye-bye.
Bye.